Here we go. Bobbing and weaving. Woo! Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this briefing on what's going on in Japanese politics. 465 seats up for grabs. My name is Timothy Langley. I'm joined by Nagatacho Forum's Dan Harada. Hello, Dan.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for listening.
Dan, the election was established 9 days ago. The prime minister, who was prime minister for less than a week, decided he was going to close down the House. In spite of all of his pronouncements that he was going to have a long period to discuss the issues and get the opposition parties and mollify some sort of a public policy position that the public can swallow. And he changed that as soon as he became prime minister. He initiated an election 9 days ago. It culminates in 3 days. Election voting is on Sunday. I guess almost immediately, absentee balloting, and balloting by mail occurred on the day after the election was caused. But Dan, this is not something that you or I have seen for many, many years, maybe even decades, the kind of confusion and the amount of turmoil that's going on here. Can you comment?
Yeah, no, Ishiba-san, when he was running for the president's campaign, said he would have a lengthy, maybe a month or 2 months, diet session. And then all of a sudden, he announced that he was dissolving the House. So this is completely incoherent. And that is one of the reasons why his, and unfortunately the party's ratings are going down.
Thank you very much. So we've been following this very closely. This is something that you and I do for a living. So we appreciate the audience tuning in. Typically on our briefings, it's mostly Japan hands. There are a couple of neophytes that are listening in who are interested in what's going on in Japanese politics, but we're speaking to the issues to those in the audience who have a little bit more of a basis of understanding of what's going on in Japanese politics. So you know that 465 seats are up for election. The LDP, in a coalition with Komeito, holds a majority in the lower house. And this majority is critical for them to be able to manage the government. They have a majority, a supermajority in the upper house, and the at risk here is the LDP losing the majority, which is they hold about 256 seats right now, and they need to maintain 233 seats to keep that majority. Dan, it doesn't look like they're going to hit those numbers come close of business on Sunday.
Well, to think that the LDP is going to keep a majority is absolutely daydreaming. There is no way, under the current situation, that they will keep a majority, Timothy.
So we haven't seen this post-war except for one brief period of time when Mr. Taro Aso was prime minister. The LDP lost in that election, and the opposition party came in for a very exciting, very brief period. It was marred by the triple disaster, and they lost power, and the LDP came back in. That was with Mr. Abe, the first Abe administration. But something like this that the LDP is confronting, they don't want to lose this majority. What options are open to them?
Well, there is a difference between now and when we first lost the majority, is that the opposition back in 2000, whenever it was united as one bloc, whereas now it is no longer the case. So it is possible for the ruling party, for the LDP, to negotiate with all the other parties and take the best candidate as a partner.
Mm-hmm. So the Secretary General of the LDP, Mr. Moriyama, pretty much guaranteed that by insisting that the election happen sooner rather than later. Mr. Ishiba, as Prime Minister, I advise you, if you want me to be your Secretary General of the LDP, I really must insist that you hold that election right away so that the opposition doesn't have a party to coalesce into blocks and give us, the LDP, a harder time. But in any event, even though they've done that with the slush fund scandal and what's going on with the Unification Church, there are so many LDP members who are at risk. I mean, they were sort of at risk even without the confusion that was caused by the LDP race. Mr. Kishida resigned. He resigned. He decided not to run again. And then there were 9 candidates there, settled down to 2 main contenders, Sanai Takaichi and Mr. Ishiba. And Mr. Ishiba won by a slim margin and immediately called for this election. But I think the proof will be in the pudding. What happens on Sunday, the LDP will lose as a consequence of perhaps not calling this election so quickly, but mostly as a consequence of the scandal that was created by the LDP faction, the Abe faction, many, many years ago, but came into public light. And lots of lots of factions within the LDP also participated in that. And those members who took money, put it in their pocket, did not report it to the tax authorities, are being attacked by the opposition party. But what you're saying is they really don't have enough time to put a candidate or to coalesce with another opposition party. Let's not have 3 candidates or 4 candidates running against this guy. We can beat him, but we can't split the vote. There are a couple of areas there are a couple of regions, districts, where that is going to unfortunately happen. But in any event, the predictions now by all the newspapers, by Gigi, by Asahi, is that the LDP will lose they will go below 233. Dan?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I know there are 267 seats, and in only 6 is it a one-on-one fight. The biggest ruling party, the biggest opposition parties. In all the other cases, the opposition is diluted. Tim.
The opposition is diluted, which means that the LDP still has a little bit more of an advantage, but probably not enough to close the gap to exceed their minimum amount, which is 233. They're standing at right now 256 when the election finished. That means that they are going to lose at least 30 seats. But I think the predictions are it's more like 40 or 50, right?
Clearly.
Yes.
Clearly.
Okay. So the news, sometimes in the United States, we have the surprise just before the election, the October surprise. I don't know if it's designed so much or if there's that much of a thought that's put into it here because it's a multi-party election campaign. But there was some great news that came out, great for the opposition, not so great for the LDP, that just hit the press, 2 days ago? Yesterday, in fact? Akahata, Dan.
Yes, the Communist Party discovered that the LDP paid money to somebody who technically was no longer a member of the party. And the Communist Party article triggered the attention of the mass media press. I won't even mention their names, but at least 2 newspapers went to the party headquarters yesterday and asked to be given an explanation as to what happened. So that puts more pressure, the idea of Diminto, bad money, dirty things, and so on, that is something that just came up in the press this morning,
Right.
and which certainly doesn't add up to help the party.
So Mr. Ishiba, as prime minister and as president of the LDP, has come on strongly, and he's on the stump speeches as well, telling people we are going to clean up the LDP. The LDP is going to be for you. All of this thing that happened with the LDP and the slush funds and people putting money in, we're finished with that. There are 33 members that we're not going to endorse as, well, they're LDP members, but we're just not going to endorse them as effectively or as efficiently as we normally do. So they're pretty much on their own, not completely. We don't want them to lose because the LDP would lose even more of an advantage that we have. But there are 10 of them that distinctly the LDP said, we can't support you. You will be off the range. You will still be perhaps registered as LDP, but you're not getting any support. And of these 10, they received political money from the LDP as well. And that's the real controversy, isn't it? That he's speaking out of two corners of the same mouth.
Yes. And until yesterday, I mean, it was bad enough, but until the news came up this morning,
it was bad enough. Right. So as prime minister, Dan, if the LDP loses a majority, there's a lot of hell to pay for that. Somebody's got to take the blame for that. And it looks like that might be, the top guy. I mean, he's the prime minister. He's the one that designed this. If the LDP loses the majority, there are many, many people in the LDP who are going to say, although we voted for you as president of the LDP and we together made you prime minister, because of the results of the election, maybe it's not all your fault, but you didn't have to call a snap election. It's your fault. And we need to make amends here. Dan?
And he's on top. Okay, so there will be people. He was elected with a very slim majority, as you said a few minutes ago, and there are people who are going to demand that he resigns. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, he might resign of his own volition, but never mind. So he is the one to have to take responsibility.
Yes. Let's put a little bit more of a finer point on that. The current government, even though the Diet is out of session, it's not only out of session, it's not even active right now, but the government in standing has decided that they will restart the government. They will have a Diet session on the 7th, which is 10 days after the election results come forward. And that time stands still right now. That is a kind of an endpoint. If the LDP loses their majority, forgetting for the moment right now what happens with Komeito, their coalition partner, by the 7th, they need to have figured out who is the prime minister, how are they going to run the government when the emperor comes across the moat to open the Diet session. Things already have to be in place. That's not very much time. And if the LDP is angry at the current prime minister, they could be saying, you need to resign, or maybe he resigns, like you said, from his own volition. But there's more likely than not going to be a major change here. We haven't seen this in the entire time I've been working Japanese politics. I think same for you, Dan.
No, there's a very short window between the Sunday night and the 7th of January, when the government has announced that it, meaning the government, wants to open a Diet session to elect the prime minister. And so the first question is, who is going to be the candidate of Jiminto, of LDP, for that election to a prime minister?
The government has to have a prime minister. It's the Constitution dictates that. And so what we're trying to convey to the audience here is he is not prime minister since he has not been endorsed by the combined sitting Diet. And so when the dust settles and the election results are in, it could be that the LDP is not in a majority position anymore. And the majority position dictates who's going to be prime minister. So between the election date and the 7th, the LDP needs to decide who their candidate is going to be. Is it going to still be Mr. Ishiba? And if it is, what does the opposition party, who more likely than not has grown in power, has grown in numbers of seats, they might be able to throw their weight around too. And in addition to that, before you go on, Dan, also Komeito might have increased their standing as well, although maybe they suffer a little bit because of their alliance with the LDP. Komeito is supposed to be the clean government party. We are in coalition with the LDP, which is not a very clean government party, and they might suffer as a consequence of that as well. It's a very complicated set of circumstances approaching before the 7th.
Yeah, Diminto has to find a leader who would win on the 7th, be elected prime minister by the Diet. But nobody, for the time being, has the foggiest idea who the candidate of the Diminto of LDP is going to be. It may be Ishiba-san, but maybe somebody else. But at this point, nobody has any idea.
So the way that the election for prime minister works is when the Diet collects, there is a vote for prime minister, and whoever has 50% of the vote becomes the representative for the entire Diet. So that prime minister should respond to all of the parties, whether they're in the opposition or not, and he is representing the votes that he has collected. So that means the LDP needs to form perhaps yet another coalition if they want to stay in power. They want to elect the prime minister. It might be that one of the opposition parties holds their nose a little bit and says, yes, we will vote with you. We will join you as a coalition partner. But this is what we want out of that. We want this, this, and this. And then we will join your coalition and we will sign off on who is to be the prime minister.
Well, I can't add anything to what you said because this is exactly what's going to happen.
Okay. So
again, the first thing that we have to decide, that Diminto has to decide, is who is going to be the top gun.
And that presumes that if the LDP decides who's going to be the top gun, then that person becomes prime minister. That's not necessarily a given, though, is it?
No, I mean, the LDP is going to suffer a big loss, but it is not conceivable that the LDP will not remain the largest party.
Okay, that's true.
The candidate to prime minister of the LDP will, in all certainty, become prime minister.
Okay. We just finished a race for the president of the LDP, which is different from prime minister, different election process, different voting, different constituencies. But we just finished with 9 good candidates. One of them came out on top. And if the blame for losing the majority is pointed at the current prime minister, it doesn't necessarily mean that as president of the LDP, he must be the next prime minister. They could choose somebody else. The Diet could choose somebody else to be the replacement prime minister. All that would be required is maybe the prime minister resign, or he's, I guess the LDP would just have to encourage him to resign voluntarily. Right, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, we know that the prime minister will become prime minister with the votes of its own vote, the LDP's vote, of Komeito, and somebody else who would come in for a coalition.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that the LDP has not decided who the candidate will be.
Right.
Most people assume that the current leader, Ishiba-san, will have to be kicked out or resign or whatever, but that's one thing. But the other thing is to decide who would replace him.
Okay, let's talk just a little bit about that. We just finished the presidential race. There are 8 other candidates who look pretty good. They've already been vetted, but I think for a smooth transition in a very limited period of time, you're not going to go through another election. You don't need to. Another election for president of the LDP. Mr. Ishiba can stay as president of the LDP, but we have candidates that we can consider, the LDP will consider, as a potential prime minister that they will endorse, they will support. The LDP will come together with the coalition partner, Komeito, and somebody else, and that individual will become prime minister. Dan, there are very few candidates who fit that bill, who have the least amount of negatives and the most amount of positives. Most people would say Sanai Takaichi is a good bet because she almost became prime minister. She was defeated by Mr. Ishiba, so she gets a shot at it. I don't think that logically falls to the conclusion, though. Do you?
No, I don't think she would be there. No, I think that the most likely one in an emergency, and we will be in an emergency, would be the chief of cabinet, Mr. Hayashi.
Mr. Hayashi was.
He ended up as a distant 3 or 4 or whatever, but he still would be acceptable in an emergency.
Mm-hmm.
The entire party, or most of the entire party.
Yeah, I agree. He has very few negatives, except for the fact that in the election for president of the LDP, he didn't do so sterlingly well. But once again, he was foreign minister. He became chief cabinet secretary. He was asked again to come in and be chief cabinet secretary under the Ishiba administration. Even throughout the campaign, I mean, most of the time he was called off on other duties as a sitting member of the cabinet. But I really like him as a potential replacement as prime minister. He could be a long-term sitting prime minister, but I think you're right. The Ishiba administration looks like it's on very short skids.
Yes, and we the time is limited. We have to decide before the 7th, which is the day when the Diet is supposed to elect the prime minister. So it's basically, internally, it's an emergency situation.
It very much is. And in fact, in order to open the Diet, the Diet is opened by the emperor. He needs to have advance notice, a very polite invitation to come over. And it could possibly be, Dan, that the opposition has gained in strength, and it could say, the 7th doesn't quite work for me. I would prefer to have something maybe a little bit later. The LDP would have to acquiesce to that. That could be them, throwing a little bit of their weight around, but it also involves the emperor's schedule as well.
Well, this is absolutely correct. I mean, depending on how well the opposition does in the election, they may refuse to go along with the government decision to open the Diet on the 7th. That is quite possible.
Just to exercise their power, yeah.
The first day to elect the prime minister will be negotiated between the government and the opposition. Mm-hmm. And you certainly cannot rule that out. But that depends upon how many seats the opposition gets during on Sunday.
Right. Dan, early election began the day after the voting started, a 12-day campaign period. It started immediately. About 25% of the votes are early voting. And throughout Sunday, the newspapers, in particular NHK, will be doing exit polling. We will have a sense of what the election results are going to be, but only a sense of it throughout Sunday. And probably when the polls close at 8 o'clock, we should have a very clear vision of who won, who's on first, who's on second. And then from the 28th until the 7th, the LDP has got to figure out how much of a coalition do we need? Do we promise cabinet seats, 2 cabinet seats? Do we promise that they will get to be prime minister and we get to be the party in power? Whatever. It's going to be a very delicate time in a very limited period of time.
It's a short window.
Yeah.
It's a short window. There's no question about it.
The other kind of interesting confluence here is that the U.S. presidential election is 2 days before this self-imposed deadline of the 7th. The United States will decide who their next president is going to be on the 5th of the same month.
I know Hayashi-san very well. he speaks perfect English, and seen from that angle only, he would be fine.
Yes, I think so too. I know that Miss Takaichi has been very active supporting those people who were distanced from the LDP. So there are a lot of people, and she actually refused a cabinet position or a party post by Mr. Ishiba after she lost to him and said, I don't want to have anything to do with your government. I will be an independent from going forward, belonging to the LDP, obviously. But she has opened herself up too. She has developed many more friends because the LDP is backing off and she is filling that void. She's a different kind of politician, though. She's very much on the right side of the spectrum. But I don't know if she's really done herself many favors because a lot of the people that she is supporting are likely to lose their seats in any event.
Well, that's absolutely correct. I mean, most of a large portion of her support when she was running for party president came from the Abe faction.
Mm-hmm.
And it is unfortunately clear that many of the Abe factions are going to fall by the wayside. So her support definitely will be weakened.
Yeah.
And I cannot see her. I could have seen her become party president and eventually prime minister, but this time in this current environment, no way.
Okay. So just in closing up, Dan, we went through the party president's campaign. It was, I think, a great time to study Japanese politicians, or at least these 9 individuals. I thought it was a great thing for Japanese democracy. It was well publicized. People were very interested. You have a breakfast briefing once a month, Nagatacho Forum. Your numbers were exceeded every month for the last 3 or 4 months because the global audience is so interested and concerned what's going on in Japanese politics. Same with the audience that I have on Sunday mornings. What's going to happen with these other 8 individuals? They're career politicians. They're not going to disappear. But even with a new administration under a new leadership, what do you think is the role of the cabinet will obviously dissolve. It won't be the same cabinet that was selected by Mr. Ishiba. Is there a role for some of these individuals that they didn't initially have? Or will some of the ones that came in quickly to support Mr. Ishiba because they helped him become party president, are they going to go by the wayside?
No, then here I do not quite agree with you. I mean, in the current environment, seeing beyond the 7th of January, I think it probably would keep the cabinet as it is now.
Okay. So just to point out that Mr. Hayashi, who is the current chief cabinet secretary, is probably number 2 in the Kishida faction, or what's left of what we would call a faction. He's probably number 2. And even with Mr. Ishiba, it was a coalition with Mr. Ishiba, Mr. Suga, and Mr. Kishida, who formed this coalition and formed this government. So it looks like you're probably right. If it sticks with Mr. Hayashi as a protege of Mr. Kishida, it stays pretty much in the family. The policies don't change that much. What the Japanese government has decided on energy, on the supplemental budget, on the status of forces, it pretty much stays. It's not as tumultuous as it possibly could be. That's what you're saying, right?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Great.
Change the head, but we don't have to change the body.
Right. So a lot is going to be decided on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We're going to stay tuned to that. Dan, I think given the complexities and the kind of emergency nature of that, today is Thursday. We should have another briefing before the 7th. You and I invite our audience back in to come in a week or in 7-8 days on Friday to give people another coffee time. It's lunchtime now. We've been going on for about half an hour to give them an update on what's happening, who's going to be on first base, what's happening with Mr. Ishiba, how much turmoil can we anticipate, how much placation can we have of the various energies and the opposition parties. What do you say to that, Dan?
I'm on board.
Great. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in today. I thought this is a great opportunity for us to tell you what is likely to happen, not just on Sunday, but before the diet comes back into session. Please stay tuned. Dan has a breakfast briefing every, the first Thursday of every month, almost. This next one will be the second Thursday, but that's because of the election cycle. So if you're interested in getting updated on that, Dan is the only, well, he's not a foreigner, he's a nationalized Japanese, but he belongs to the LDP, has been doing this business for, I don't know, 40 years. Having a breakfast with other people who are interested at the Capital Tokyo Hotel. And then on my part, I have a weekly briefing on Sunday mornings, 8:20, with apologies, but we talk about what's happened in Japanese politics during that week. Different texture for both of these, but you're invited. Dan, you got the last word?
Well, thank you very much. That's the best thing I can say.
Thank
See you soon.
Thank you for your insight and for sharing your knowledge here. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. See you next week on Friday at noon, if not sooner.
Thank you.